The forgotten bomb beneath the campfire. In September of 2021, Lydia Makarchuk and her husband, Norbert Varga, embarked on what was supposed to be a long overdue celebration, a honeymoon trip to Ukraine, Lydia's homeland. The couple had been married for 2 years, yet due to various complications, they had postponed this visit multiple times. Now, at last, they would reunite with Lydia's family, who had missed their wedding. It was meant to be a joyous occasion, a time for connection and togetherness. But hidden beneath the soil of an ancient battlefield, something waited. Something silent, something lethal. The journey to the mountains. Lydia had been particularly excited for this trip because it would give her husband a chance to finally bond with her younger brother, Miroslav. She was close to Miroslav. His approval of Norbert mattered to her. And so, to ensure they had a proper chance to connect, Miroslav arranged a special outing, a camping trip in the Carpathian Mountains where the crisp air and starlit sky would offer an intimate setting to talk and get to know each other. Their destination was a well-known campsite, a clearing nestled high up in the mountains with breathtaking views and an endless sky of twinkling stars. A place of beauty, a place of peace. Or so they thought. On September 15th, the last night of their stay in Ukraine, Lydia, Norbert, Miroslav, and 9 other family members packed up their tents and supplies, then set off. They drove to the base of the Carpathian Range and began their ascent. The hike took 2 hours, their breath fogging in the evening chill as they climbed. At last, they reached their destination, a picturesque site with a stunning overlook of the dense forest below. The night was perfect. They pitched their tents, gathered firewood, and soon a fire crackled warmly, its golden light flickering against the darkness of the wild. They laughed, they swapped stories. Tea was passed around as old friends and family members basked in the warmth of reunion. The sky stretched above them, infinite and silent as the fire burned, and deep beneath them something stirred. The explosion. As the evening wore on, Norbert finally had a long, uninterrupted conversation with Miroslav. Lydia watched them, heart swelling with happiness. This was exactly what she had hoped for, a perfect ending to their long-awaited honeymoon. Then, around 9 p.m., Norbert stood up. He patted his pockets and announced that he had left his camera in their tent. Lydia nodded absently, watching him disappear into the dark. And then, a strange sound, a whistling, faint at first but rising, shrieking, slicing through the air. Before Lydia could react, something struck her face, hard, a crushing impact against her nose. A blinding pain exploded through her skull. Instantly, her world went black. She couldn't see, she couldn't hear. The ground tilted and suddenly she was down, sprawled in the dirt. The pain in her face was excruciating. Her body felt heavy, disconnected. The only thing she could process was the absolute certainty that something terrible had happened. Something she might not survive. Somewhere in the blackness, voices screamed, agonized, panicked wails. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning earth, smoke, of blood. Her voice, her name, a desperate phantom cry. Robert's voice was her. Suddenly she felt hands on her. He was gripping her, calling her name over and over. She tried to speak, to ask what had happened. Her voice barely worked. When she managed to force out the words, there was a long, terrible silence. Then Norbert answered, his voice hollow with horror, "It's bad, it's really bad." The forgotten killer, what they would later learn, was that their idyllic campsite had been sitting atop a remnant of an old war, a buried, unexploded bomb from World War I, forgotten beneath the soil for over a century. That night, their fire had unknowingly acted as a slow-burning fuse. Year after year, countless other campers had come and gone, their fires weakening the rusted shell of the buried explosive. That night, with Lydia and her family sitting around it, the fire finally reached the last fragile layer of metal. The whistling Lydia had heard was the sound of the casing giving way, as the force of a century-old death machine releasing into the light. The impact that had struck her face was frightening. Two people did not survive the explosion. One of them was Miroslav. Lydia was severely injured, but lived. The moment before the explosion, when Norbert had left to get his camera, was likely the only reason he had survived at all. The serene clearing in the mountains had seemed like paradise, a perfect escape. But beneath the soil, the ghosts of a long-forgotten war had waited patiently. And on that night, the crackling of a simple campfire, history reached up to the grave and took its final echoes. Here's the last known photo of the group, taken just minutes before the blast. Their faces frozen in laughter, unaware that within moments, their world would be torn apart. Some things refused to stay buried. The ocean of death. In 2015, I was stationed overseas with my military unit for training. Our exercises typically involved working on land and in the ocean. But upon arrival in this particular country, we received an unusual warning. We were not to enter the water without full body protection. The reason? The water was too dangerous, too toxic. We were skeptical. We had trained in some truly awful conditions before, dealing with hazardous environments and questionable water quality, but nothing had ever warranted such a dire restriction. What could possibly be so bad that we weren't even allowed to set foot in it? Then we saw it. Standing at the edge of the water, we stared in disbelief. The surface was thick, blackened tar-like sludge, streamed in slow, sickly waves, tainted with oil and chemicals. Thousands upon thousands of plastic fragments bobbed grotesquely, floating in clusters so dense that the water was nearly invisible beneath them. And the smell. It reeked of rot and stagnation, a rancid mixture of death and decay. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Dead sea lions, dead birds. Other creatures grotesquely bloated, tangled in plastic, their bodies grotesquely twisted. Some had clearly suffocated, their final moments spent desperately struggling against the man-made noose tightening around them. The ocean wasn't just polluted, it was a graveyard. But the worst part? No one was cleaning it up. No one was even trying. That's why when Mr. Beast and his team approached me about joining Team Seas, an initiative to remove 30 million pounds of plastic from the ocean, I didn't hesitate. If you've ever wondered whether small actions make a difference, consider this. Every single dollar donated to Team Seas removes 1 pound of garbage from the water. The ocean is choking, it's dying. We can help. Join us. The Curse of the San Juan Mountains, the cannibal named Alfred Packer. The winter of 1874 was relentless, burying the western Colorado mountains beneath an unforgiving blanket of snow. In a secluded valley, a group of 6 gold prospectors, led by the grizzled 65-year-old Israel Swan, huddled around a dwindling fire, their faces gaunt, their stomachs empty. Weeks of being trapped in the valley had left them weak and desperate. The air crackled with tension as they debated their dwindling options. Among them sat Alfred Packer, a wiry 30-year-old drifter with wild eyes and an insatiable hunger, not just for survival, but for something deeper, something darker. He had never been truly trusted by the others. They whispered about his epilepsy, his laziness, his lack of discipline. But what Israel saw in him was different. Packer was hungry in a way that others were not. He had a drive, an instinct, a primal cunning that made him dangerous. Then came the voice of doom. From the shadows, a towering figure stepped forward. Chief Ure of the Ute tribe had been their lifeline, rescuing them from certain death, feeding them, sheltering them. Now his face was grim, his voice a harbinger of death. If you leave now, you will all die. A deep silence followed his words. The men shivered, not from the cold, but from something else, a gnawing dread. But Packer, ever the restless one, refused to be trapped like a caged animal. His hunger for freedom, for gold, was louder than the warning. One by one, he convinced the others. Israel, despite his better judgment, agreed. The 4 remaining men followed suit. With that, they turned their backs on the only man who had shown them kindness, and they vanished into the snow-covered abyss of the San Juan Mountains, into the frozen hell The world around them became a white nightmare. The mountains were jagged and unforgiving, looming over them like silent executioners. Their supplies thin, the frost bit at their flesh, gnawed at their bones. Each step was heavier than the last. Their progress slowed, and their bodies weakened. Packer lagged behind, his movements sluggish, his gaze distant. But his eyes never stopped moving, darting between the men watching, calculating. Then the first man disappeared. Perhaps he wandered off, delirious from hunger. Perhaps someone ensured he wouldn't make it any farther. No one questioned it. No one spoke his name. They simply trudged on, dragging their exhausted bodies forward, their breath forming clouds of ice in the air. Then another man was gone, and another. The remaining men were too weak to question the vanishings. Their minds, dulled by starvation and fear, refused to acknowledge the horror unfolding around them. Packer, however, remained strong, too strong. He moved with an unnatural energy, his eyes gleaming with something beyond survival. Then came the final night. Israel Swan, the last remaining member of the original group, awoke to the sound of heavy breathing. His vision blurred from exhaustion. Through the darkness, he saw him, Alfred Packer, crouched near the fire, his hands coated in something dark, something red. A glistening bone protruded from the flames. A human bone. Before Israel could react, a flash of steel cut through the night. A scream died in his throat. The cold steel met flesh, and the fire crackled with renewed life. The last witness was silence, the butcher of the mountains. 2 months later, on April 16, 1874, a gaunt, wild-eyed man stumbled into an outpost near Breckenridge, Colorado. His hair, tangled and unkempt, clung to his forehead in damp tendrils. His clothes, tattered and stained, hung from his skeletal frame. In one hand he clutched a rifle, in the other, a metal coffee pot. Alfred Packer had emerged from the mountains. The outpost officials, startled by the ghostly figure before them, hurried him inside. They placed food in front of him, and he tore into it like a starving animal. His hands trembled as he shoveled meat into his mouth, his teeth gnashing, his lips smeared with grease. Then suddenly he clutched his stomach, retched violently, and vomited onto the floor. "Sorry," he gasped. "It's been a long time since I've had real food." The men exchanged uneasy glances. When questioned, Packer claimed the others had died one by one, taken by the merciless winter. He told them he had survived on tree bark, on roots, on anything he could find. The officials nodded solemnly. It made sense. The mountains were cruel, the cold was deadly, but something gnawed at them. Packer wasn't emaciated. He was thin but not skeletal, not like a man who had spent 2 months starving. And then there was the matter of his coffee pot. It still held hot coals. The cannibals came. Months later, on August 20th, 1874, an artist named John Randolph was hiking through the San Juan Mountains when a foul stench filled the air, the sickly sweet rot of decay. He followed the scent, stepping cautiously through the underbrush until he reached a clearing. The first thing he saw were the bodies. 5 men lay in a row, their corpses in varying states of decay. Some were skeletons, their flesh long devoured. Others still bore the raw wounds of butchery, their chests split open, their organs missing. One man had nothing at all. Randolph staggered back, fire rising in his throat. His eyes kept moving, drawn to the fire pit, lacking arms. Cracked open to their marrow. Lay among the charred earth, beyond the pit, hidden by the its interior Packer had not just survived. He had feasted on his companions. Justice for the dead. When confronted, Packer rolled tangled lies. He stammered. He insisted that he had only killed in self-defense, that the others had turned on each other, that he had no choice. But even as he spun his tales, there was one thing he never denied. He had eaten human flesh. I liked the taste. I couldn't help myself. The jury did not hesitate. Packer was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But fate was cruel. In 1901, at the age of 92, the butcher of the San Juan Mountains was granted parole. He lived out his remaining years in quiet obscurity, a shadow of the monster he had once been. In a final irony, he became a vegetarian. The legend lives on. To this day, the San Juan Mountains remain haunted by whispers of Alfred Packer. Travelers speak of footsteps crunching through the snow, of unseen eyes watching from the trees. Some claim they've smelled roasting meat where no fire should be. And on the coldest nights, if you listen closely, you may hear it, a low, hollow laugh